House. There are a number of polls out there, including a CBS News Battleground Tracker poll, that show Joe Biden is either tied or leading the president in some key swing states. But there is one leading forecaster out there that, has a very impressive track record, and he's suggesting that maybe the polls aren't where you want to look. Maybe there are different metrics when you want to make an accurate prediction. Professor Allan Lichtman has studied presidential elections for decades and has has been right in every presidential election since 1984, including Mr. Trump's ultimate victory in 2016. He has done so by building a system consisting of 13 questions, and he's already made his prediction for 2020. And Professor Lichtman is joining us now. Professor, you are a professor of history at American University. Really, really glad you are joining us.
Thank you.
What I love about your 13 questions is they're really simple and accessible. And as I was watching, because you did this really, really great video, I was, it was almost like a game trying to predict what your answer was going to be, true or false, because your 13 questions have it's either true or false, and then you check mark on one side or the other. And if it comes out to be six falses or six truths, then that determines, which way you predict the election's going to go. But hey, listen, there's a whole industry of pollsters out there, right? They call people up, they ask questions, they crunch the numbers. So before we get into your system, I want to ask you, what's your take on polling? I mean, are we misguided by looking at these polls?
The pollsters are great people. They're friends of mine. They do their job well. The problem is polls are not predictors. I will repeat that. Polls are not predictors. They are snapshots at a given point in time, and that snapshot could change overnight. So it's not tethered to any reality. How do you know whether the situation has changed? You take another poll, and so on and so on. The other problem with the polls, of course, is likely voters. They don't know who's actually going to vote, so they have to estimate who likely voters are. So when they tell you the error margin is plus and minus 3 or 4%, that's statistical error. That doesn't take into account the error from estimating likely voters. Why are we so obsessed with polls? Again, journalists are great friends of mine, but it's the lazy person's way of doing journalism. To get out of bed in the morning to write a story about the polls, all you have to do is read it. And here's what's happened in America. Dwight Eisenhower in 1961 warned about the military-industrial complex. Well, we have the political-industrial complex in America. We have the pollsters, the consultants, and the handlers who make huge amounts of money from doing what they do. Then we have the media who has to cover the election every single day. What's better than the polls for tracking that? And then, of course, we have the candidates who think falsely that they benefit by following all of this. Very hard iron triangle to crack.
Okay, so you can't deny your track record, and you were amongst the few who had predicted that President Trump is going to win the 2016 election in defiance of the polls. So let us talk about your system. How did it come to be? What makes these 13 questions such powerful predictors?
The reason they work is that they reflect how American presidential elections really work. And that is, American presidential elections are essentially votes up or down on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. All of the wind of the campaigns don't matter, not the speeches, the debates, the ads, the tricks of the campaign. Voters are pragmatic, and they decide whether the performance is good enough to give the party holding the White House another 4 years. Guess what? Amazingly, it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. And the keys gauge the big picture of incumbent performance and strength, looking at things like third parties, midterm elections, long and short-term economy, social unrest, scandal, foreign policy successes and failures, policy change. And only two of the keys have anything to do with the candidates. And they ask the very high threshold question, whether the challenger or the incumbent is that once in a generation Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan charismatic candidate. And the way it works, if 6 or more of these true false questions are false, that's a negative against the party in power, and they lose. 6 strikes and you're out.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that the only questions that pertain to the candidates or the incumbent had to do with charisma, because I thought, geez, it's the one thing that's sort of subjective. You know, does this guy make you feel good? Does he inspire you? And it's certainly when you look at somebody like Donald Trump, boy, you know, depending on who you ask, you can get radically different questions. But I suppose charisma, whether the person is turning you off or engaging, is, you know, even if they're turning you off, I guess there's something powerful about that personality.
Yeah, it's much less subjective than you would think. Because, as I said, this is very special. You're talking about the once in a generation. And here's why I count that key against Donald Trump. Yes, he is a great showman. But to meet the criteria of that key, when you buy my book, Predicting the Next President, I have a detailed explanation of how to turn the key. You have to be broadly appealing. And we know Donald Trump appeals only to a narrow slice of the electorate. Maybe 42% approve of him, but only 25% strongly approve. That's not enough to win that key.
Okay, so your prediction for 2020 is?
7 negative keys against the incumbent Republicans, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is predicted to lose the presidential election. At one time, I used to predict the popular vote, but that's useless now because the Democrats pick up automatically 5 to 6 million extra votes in 2 states alone, New York and California. So Democrats will win any close election. The baseline has shifted. So as in 2016, I now only predict the winner.
All right. So then let me ask you this question about 2020, because it's been such a wacky year. And as I was sort of going through your questions, I thought so much of what has happened has really only that you know, could determine whether a question would be answered false or true, has happened only in the last 6 months, really since January. You know, the coronavirus, the protests that we've been seeing in the streets, though we did see, you know, many protests at the beginning of the president's term. I thought to myself, I wonder how these questions would be answered even a mere 8 months ago, if the conclusion would have been different just 8 months ago.
Absolutely, yes. Donald Trump was cruising the election in 2019. He only had 4 negative keys against him, but then he made a fundamental mistake. You know, right here in my study on my wall, I have a letter on the Washington Post where I predicted his win, which says, Professor, congrats, good call. And then in big Sharpie letters, the personal signature of Donald J. Trump. But he didn't understand the real meaning of the keys, which is it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. And when he was confronted with these new crises in 2020, he made a huge mistake both for the nation and himself. Instead of trying to solve racial injustice, trying to deal with the pandemic, he thought he could talk his way out of it. And the result are the failures that sunk his reelection chances. Never in the history of the presidency has there been such a quick reversal of fortune. Donald Trump's failures to deal with our crises turned 3 more keys against him for a total of 7. The short-term economy, because we plunged into recession. The long-term economy, because this relentlessly negative growth has driven his long-term growth below that of the Obama years, and of course the widespread social unrest. So you're absolutely right. We've had an historically unprecedented reversal of fortune here, but the president has no one to blame but himself.
All right, and very quickly, because I know you have to leave, what if something happens in the next few months? Could we see your prediction turn again? Because 2020 has been perhaps one of the wackiest years that many of us have ever lived. What if something changes before November?
Well, the keys are the big picture. They don't change easily. The economy is not suddenly going to soar in a month or two. Social unrest is not going to suddenly end. But there are two things that are outside the purview of the keys or any prediction system that keep me awake at night. One, you talked about very eloquently in your previous segment, and you're right, that reporter was extraordinary. Voter suppression. Donald Trump and his enablers are working as hard as possible to suppress the vote. Look, we know they depend on people like me, old white men. That's the most shrinking part of the electorate. They can't create more old white men, but they can try to keep down the votes of the Democratic base, which is rising, of minorities and young people. Second thing that keeps me awake at night is Russian interference. We know the Russians are coming back, and we know Donald Trump again is going to welcome and exploit.
Professor, fascinating talking to you, Professor Lichtman. I urge people to Google his name and look up those questions and see what you think for yourself. Thank you so much.
And Marie, let me make one more point. It is the world's only do-it-yourself prediction system. You're right. Anyone can answer my questions and become a forecaster.
I love it. I posted it on my social media platforms because I think this is going to keep people engaged and spark some really good conversations. And that's what we need to do, talk more about this sort of stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you.